Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my February wrap-up. So in February, let me grab my notes, I read 12 books total. 3 of those books were off my shelves, so that's not great. That's not what we're aiming for, but that's what happened in February. I brought 4 books total in, and I unhauled 1 book, so that left me basically 4 in, 4 out. So my total physical TBR remained the same at 147. So even though, I read a lot of books, 12 books is a great number of books for 1 month for me. And I didn't read too many off my own personal shelves. It's okay because I didn't bring in too many. Before we get started on what I did read, I'll just quickly share with you the 4 books that I did bring into my home last month. The first book is Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President by Candice Millard. And this is a book about James Garfield, which is the next book in my presidential project that I'm reading, a presidential biography for each of the presidents. So this is the next president that I have to read about, James Garfield. I've read Candice Millard before. I read River of Doubt and loved it. And I've heard that this book is excellent. Of course, James Garfield being one of, was assassinated. So that's, rare enough in our history. And Candice Millard does wonderful popular history books. So I'm very excited to get to this one. I plan to read this one hopefully in March if everything goes right. I then brought in another nonfiction book. I brought in SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard. I have been wanting to read this book for quite a long while, but after reading Cleopatra in January, I definitely wanted to get to this one sooner rather than later. And so Britta Bowler and I are going to be buddy reading this one in March. So this one's definitely on the docket. The next 2 books I was very kindly sent by my book fairy godmother, Judy. She had heard me talk about when I hauled Black Swan Green by David Mitchell, and I had talked about the fact that I want to read all of David Mitchell's works, and I'd read a bunch of them in the past, and she had a couple of his books that she was willing to share with me. So she very kindly sent me 2 signed copies, and the first one is Ghostwritten by David Mitchell, and this is I think this is his sort of autofiction book, and this says it is a mesmerizing series of linked narratives, which is awesome because Cloud Atlas is a linked narrative story by David Mitchell, and that's my favorite one of his stories. So I'm very excited to try this one. And then Number 9 Dream is the other book that Judy sent me by David Mitchell. And this is, I don't even know what this one is about. This is probably the one I know the least about. It's about a young boy or a young man who goes to Tokyo to find the father he's never known. I guess he's 20 when he does that. So this is sort of has some Japanese stuff in it, and that should be quite interesting. Those 2, very excited to add to my collection and to continue my reading of David Mitchell. Okay, so back to the books that I completed in February. I have my reading log here, and that will help me because most of the books that I finished in February were either library books that I've since returned to the library or audiobooks or ebooks that I read through Scribd. So I need to refer to my notes. So the first book that I haven't talked about, so I'm just going to start from the books. There was a bunch of books I read in the beginning of February that I've talked about in earlier videos. I'm going to skip right over those, and I'm going to just wrap up the books that I haven't really talked about on the channel to this point. So I think I had mentioned that I was reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was one of the books on my classics reading project that I've been working on for many years. It seemed like February was the right month to read Uncle Tom's Cabin since it's Black History Month. So it's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was published in the 1840s or 50s or right before the Civil War. I can't remember the exact date, by a white woman who was an abolitionist. And so this book is huge. It's like 600 and some pages, and it's the fictional tale of Uncle Tom, who is a slave on a plantation in Kentucky. his master and mistress have been very good to him, but they run into financial difficulties and they sell Tom down south, down the river, basically. And it's all about what happens to Tom through many adventures, different owners, as he is forced to leave his family. He has a wife and children on the plantation in Kentucky. He's forced to leave them. It's all about what happens to him after he's sold down the river. And there's also a parallel story of some other folks from the same plantation who escape and head north to Canada. So it's their story as well as Uncle Tom's story. And while I understand the importance of Uncle Tom when it was written, as a way to get white people to talk about the horrors of slavery, as a 21st century reader, it is just so, what's the word that I want? I don't even know what the word is. It's not a hard book to read at all. It's very easy to read, but it's so preachy. It's so preachy. Harriet Beecher Stowe was I think she was a Quaker, and she's, wrapping her argument against slavery around, well, if you believe you're a Christian, then you cannot support slavery because Christian values do not support what happens to people who are being held as slaves, which I agree with 100%. But she just, like, whole sections of this book are basically sermons that she's giving, and it's just, I am not a particularly religious person, and I just found all of that stuff to be just too much. It was just too much for me. And the story is very melodramatic. All of the characters are either angels or demons. Uncle Tom himself is sort of like a Jesus Christ come back to earth type of a character. He's just way too good to be true. And the things that happen, whilst I guess she took real life examples for a lot of the things that happened in the story were based on real life examples of things that had happened during that time period, but she puts them all together into her characters. And so while the individual things that happened were very good at shocking you and sort of like rubbing your face in what happens to slaves, like overall the entirety of this 600 and some page novel, it was too much. So I could have done without all the religious subtext. It wasn't even subtext. I could have done without all the sermonizing, and I could have done with a little more subtlety. This book has no subtlety. That's what I want to say, is no subtlety in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I finished that on ebook. And then I also finished, I believe I've talked about this one a little bit more in previous videos, but I was on audiobook listening to If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. I was buddy reading that with Lindsay, and I have read a few James Baldwin books in the past and really wanted to read If Beale Street Could Talk. And it was a really good book. It tells the story of Tish and Fawny, two young African Americans in Harlem in early 1900s. I can't remember exactly. No, it wasn't. I'm sorry. In the 70s. It was like 60s, 70s, 1960s, 1970s in New York City. They have known each other since they were children. They fall in love. They're starting their life together. Fawny is accused of a horrible crime and put in prison. He did not commit this crime, and Tish is left to with her family, try to get him justice and get him released from prison. In the meantime, Tish finds out she's pregnant. So she's dealing with all of that. It's the two of them, their love story. You flash back to when they were children and how they came to be together and their life together. That part of the story is awesome. It really, James Baldwin does an excellent job of delving into the problems in our criminal justice system and the bias and the prejudice and the horrible injustices that are perpetrated against Black people in this country. All of that is great. The problem that I have with this book, what kept this book from being like a really top-notch read for me, was the misogyny. Like, Baldwin, I don't know what I understand this book is like a product of its place and time in the 60s and 70s, but the casual violence and misogyny towards women was really off-putting, really difficult to read, and it's not interrogated at all in the book. It's just offered up as normal, matter of fact, this is just the way it is, and without any, like, none of the characters question how women are treated at all, and it's just horrible. And there's a lot of, Tish is treated very like a kid, like a child, even though she's, 19 years old and pregnant. She's treated like she's just a kid, and all that kind of stuff. That's difficult. So that was my problems with it. But overall, I think the story is really good. Baldwin obviously is an excellent writer. He's very lyrical. His prose he's an intellectual, right? He was one of the foremost intellectual of our time, especially talking about culture and race in America. But the misogyny is just, it's tough. It's very tough. The next book I finished was a nonfiction book, The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. I was buddy reading this book with Karen from Run Right Reads and Patrice, and The Yellow House is Broom's story of her family and growing up in New Orleans. She grew up in a very big family. She has 11 brothers and sisters, and she was raised, she was the last child, and her dad died when she was only 6 months old, and so her mom raises herself and all of her siblings by herself. They don't have a lot of money. They live in a very poverty-stricken part of New Orleans, what's called New Orleans East. And through her family story and the story of this house where they all live, the Yellow House, Sarah Broom is discussing, what is family? What does it mean to be in a family? What is home? Is home the actual physical building that you live in? Is it your family? Is it where you make your home? All of those kinds of ideas she's trying to figure out for herself. So we follow her life story from when she's a child all the way up through current day, and she's like probably at this point in her 30s. And it's very interesting because in the middle of her story, when she's in her 20s, she's been to college, I think she's out of college, and she's working in New York City, is when Hurricane Katrina hits. And the impact of the hurricane on her family and the Yellow House is explored within this book. What I found really, what really came out to me through this book was how our government and our systems, our bureaucratic systems, fail people, not only people of color, but obviously people of color, but based on your economic class, you can count on better or worse service from your government, and it should not be that way. Everybody should get the same level of service from the government, regardless of your economic class, regardless of your racial, what race you belong to. And obviously that is not what's happening in the United States. And the Yellow House really demonstrates that when her family, Sarah Broom's family, has to go, what they have to go through to try to get help after Hurricane Katrina, and what happens to their house. And then it takes 12 years after Hurricane Katrina for them to get any relief. Horrible, just horrible. And it really made me think about how different people can count on different levels of service after things like hurricanes or other natural disasters. Not to mention all of the stuff that Sarah Broom is talking about in terms of family, and how you as you grow up tell yourself, or how you, what's the word I want? I'm really struggling here today. What impacts your family has on your ability to make a home for yourself. Whether or not you're able to sort of build your own home has a lot to do with where you came from, and what kind of family and home you had to start with. And because when she was born, she lost her dad, she's the youngest of all these children, her mom's struggling to make ends meet as a single parent, she sort of is untethered. through a lot of her childhood because of that. And she's still struggling with that as an adult, this untethered feeling, and trying to struggle to figure out where she fits in and where she can call home. So that's really great. The Yellow House is excellent. I finished another romance novel, the third book in the Ravenel series by Lisa Kleypas, called Devil in Spring. I was buddy reading this with my romance reading buddies, Doris and Katie. This was excellent. It's my favorite in the series so far. This is Pandora's story. She is a very unconventional young lady. She does not like to dance. She does not like balls. She's not interested in being married because she is developing board games and patenting them and getting the production system in place to produce her board games. And she wants to own her own business. And she knows if she gets married, she will not have any control anymore over her business. Like, it will all belong to her husband, and if he might be a nice guy and he might allow her to work or to have this business, but she won't have the control over it in the end. So that's all her plans. But then, of course, she meets the heir to a dukedom, and sparks fly and stuff happens, and now all of a sudden she's facing the fact that she's probably going to have to get married to this guy. And she doesn't want to, because she doesn't want to give up the freedom to own her own business. And I think that is awesome. It was such a great story. So many awesome historical details in this romance novel. Really, really good exploration of the topic of a woman's lack of control over her own destiny at that time period. I really appreciated it, along with the fun of a good romance. So that one I can highly recommend. I finished another book for the BookTube Prize, How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones, which I can't really discuss, but I just want to note that I finished that one. I also, at the beginning of the month, I don't think I talked about it, finished Say Nothing, which is about the Troubles in Ireland, and I cannot remember the name of that author off the top of my head. Patrick something Keefe, maybe. But I will put it up on the screen. I also finished Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. That's the last book I finished in February, and that's the second book in the Cromwell series that I've been reading in anticipation of the third book in the series coming out in March. And I really enjoyed, it wasn't Wolf Hall, I do apologize for that. It was Bring Up the Bodies, which is book 2. My notes are incorrect here. Bring Up the Bodies, book 2. Really liked it. I actually thought it did a little bit better than the first book in making sure that you understand when Thomas Cromwell is speaking, when we're getting it from his point of view directly, because there was some confusion with pronouns in the first book. This book, that I didn't have that trouble at all. And because I was already familiar with the characters from Wolf Hall, it was much smoother for me to get into this one. And in book 2, we're really dealing with the Henry and Anne, King Henry VIII, and Anne Boleyn's marriage is falling apart. And so that's basically what we're dealing with the entire time, is their marriage is falling apart. Cromwell's trying to solidify his political position and make sure that when that marriage finally, he can see the writing on the wall, he knows it's going to dissolve. This marriage is going away somehow by hook or by crook. And he's trying to position himself in the best way possible so that he doesn't lose power when that happens. And so all of those machinations are happening while all the other people are trying to jockey for position as well. Of course, Cromwell being not a gentleman, not from any aristocratic family, just comes from a regular, his father was a blacksmith or whatever, or he was a blacksmith. So he's a common man, and him as a commoner trying to, get his position with these, aristocrats is the crux of the story. Very interesting. A lot of Cromwell's, what's the word? He's not a kind and gentle person, and you really make it clear, like, he's willing to do what needs to be done so that he can keep his power. And that it becomes very clear throughout the course of this book. Really enjoyed it. Very much looking forward to book 3. So that's it. That is what I read towards the end of February. It was a very good reading month. I feel really pleased that I read so many books that qualify for reading in Black History Month. And most of them were very good. So I feel like I got a lot out of that themed reading this month. There's a ton of themes reading that I'm going to be doing in March. I'll talk about that in a future video. I hope you all read some great books in February, and I'll talk to you later.